It was February 1963. The grandstands at Daytona were packed. Engines roared across the banking. Ford was confident. Chrysler was dangerous. NASCAR's horsepower war was reaching a boiling point. And then Chevrolet showed up with something nobody had seen before. It didn't have a name. It didn't have a badge. Reporters couldn't identify it. Rival teams couldn't figure it out. Even some GM insiders barely understood what they were looking at. All they knew was that it was terrifyingly fast. The engine would become known as the mystery motor, a secret racing weapon developed by General Motors. A machine so powerful, so advanced, and so politically dangerous that it was effectively silenced before it could fulfill its potential. Most people have heard of the Hemi. Most people know the legendary big block Chevys that dominated drag strips in the late 1960s. But what almost nobody knows is that the deadliest racing engine GM ever built wasn't officially supposed to exist. And what happened next changed everything. To understand the mystery motor, you have to understand the war that created it. The early 1960s were brutal in American motorsports. Every major manufacturer wanted dominance. Winning races sold cars, and nowhere was that more obvious than NASCAR. This wasn't gentlemen's competition. This was corporate warfare disguised as sport. Ford had invested millions into its racing programs. Their FE Series engines were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Engineers worked overtime developing stronger components, better breathing cylinder heads, more aggressive camshaft profiles. Every weekend brought new data. Every race revealed weaknesses that needed fixing. Ford's commitment was absolute. Chrysler wasn't backing down either. Their engineering teams were equally obsessed. The corporation's leadership understood what Ford already knew. Racing victories translated directly into showroom traffic. Young buyers wanted speed. They wanted power. They wanted to drive what won on Sunday. Chrysler's wedge-head V8s were evolving rapidly. Displacement was climbing. Compression ratios were increasing. The famous Hemi was still in development, waiting to shock the racing world. But that shock was coming soon. Everyone could feel it. The horsepower war wasn't just accelerating. It was becoming an arms race where every manufacturer needed bigger weapons just to survive. Meanwhile, Chevrolet was trapped. In 1957, General Motors had officially withdrawn factory support from organized racing. The decision came from the highest levels of corporate leadership. Publicly, GM executives claimed racing wasn't part of the company's future. They wanted to appear responsible and corporate. They worried about insurance liability. They worried about government regulation. They worried about public perception after several high-profile racing deaths. The Automobile Manufacturers Association had established guidelines discouraging racing involvement. GM decided to follow those guidelines strictly, at least on paper. Unofficially, nobody stopped the engineers from dreaming. Deep inside Chevrolet's engineering department, a small group began working on something radical. These weren't renegade outsiders. These were some of the most talented engine designers in America. Men who understood thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and metallurgy at levels most people couldn't comprehend. They looked at what Ford was doing. They studied what Chrysler was developing. And they realized Chevrolet was falling behind. That was unacceptable. The goal was simple: beat everybody. The result was extraordinary. The project started with Chevrolet's existing W-Series big block architecture. But engineers quickly realized they needed something entirely new. The old design was reaching its limits. Displacement could only increase so much. Valve sizes were constrained by combustion chamber design. Airflow was restricted by head architecture. Incremental improvements weren't enough. They needed revolution, not evolution. So they created a prototype unlike anything Chevrolet had produced before. The engine displaced 427 cubic inches. It used a massive 4.3125-inch bore and a 3.65-inch stroke. That oversized bore allowed enormous valves and incredible airflow. And airflow was everything. The cylinder bore diameter was absolutely critical. Larger bores meant larger valves. Larger valves meant more air and fuel entering the combustion chamber. More air and fuel meant more power. But the real innovation was in the cylinder heads. Instead of traditional wedge-style combustion chambers, the mystery motor used semi-Hemi cylinder heads with canted valves. Intake and exhaust valves sat at different angles, allowing air to move through the engine more efficiently than almost any American V8 of the era. The intake valves were tilted one direction, the exhaust valves tilted another. This created straighter paths for air to enter and exit. Less turbulence meant better flow. Better flow meant more power. The advantages compounded at higher RPM when airflow became most critical. Engineers had studied Chrysler's Hemi design. They understood the hemispherical combustion chamber's advantages, but they also recognized its complications. True Hemi heads were expensive to manufacture. The valve train was complex. Production costs were substantial. The canted-valve semi-Hemi design offered most of the benefits with fewer complications. It was brilliant compromise. On paper, factory estimates ranged around 430 horsepower. But race teams quickly discovered the truth. Those numbers were fiction. Conservative fiction meant to avoid attention. With proper tuning, open headers, aggressive camshafts, and race fuel, the engine was producing somewhere between 550 and 600 horsepower. In 1963, those numbers were shocking. For comparison, most street performance engines of the era struggled to exceed 400 horsepower. Ford's best FE engines were making around 425 horsepower in race trim. Chrysler's wedge motors were in similar territory. The mystery motor wasn't just stronger, it belonged to another world. It represented a quantum leap that competitors couldn't immediately explain. When Chevrolet's cars started posting lap times that seemed impossible, rival teams assumed illegal modifications. They tore through the rulebook looking for violations. They found nothing. Because technically, Chevrolet wasn't breaking any rules. NASCAR's regulations at the time were somewhat loose regarding cylinder head design. The mystery motor exploited gray areas nobody had previously considered. But there was a problem. Nobody knew whether it would survive. Building horsepower is easy. Keeping an engine alive at 7,000 revolutions per minute for hundreds of miles is something else entirely. The engineers faced enormous challenges. The huge cylinder heads created cooling concerns. More power meant more heat. Heat was the enemy of reliability. Valve train stability became critical at high RPM. The valve springs needed to control valve motion precisely. Any valve float at high RPM could cause catastrophic failure. The combustion chambers generated tremendous heat and pressure. Piston design became crucial. Ring seal had to remain perfect under extreme conditions. One engineer reportedly described testing sessions as controlled explosions, and he wasn't exaggerating. At full throttle, the engine consumed fuel at astonishing rates. Carburation became a science project. Getting enough fuel into all 8 cylinders evenly required careful jetting and constant adjustment. Exhaust temperatures were extreme. Headers glowed cherry red during sustained high-speed runs. Heat management wasn't optional. It was survival. Components that looked perfect on the drawing board suddenly became weak points after a few hundred laps. Valve springs failed, push rods bent, rocker arms cracked. Every test session revealed new problems. Every problem required new solutions. The engineers worked relentlessly, redesigning components, testing new materials, trying different approaches. Progress came in inches. What they discovered next changed everything. The engine's airflow characteristics were unlike anything Chevrolet had previously developed. The canted valve design allowed enormous breathing capacity. Air entered straighter. Exhaust exited faster. Volumetric efficiency improved dramatically. Think of it this way. Most engines were trying to breathe through a straw. The mystery motor was breathing through a tunnel. The intake ports were optimized for maximum flow. Engineers had spent countless hours flow bench testing different port shapes, different valve angles, different combustion chamber designs. Every tiny improvement was captured and refined. As a result, power climbed relentlessly as RPM increased. Drivers reported something unusual. Most big V8s felt strongest in the middle of the power band. Peak torque arrived around 4,000 or 5,000 revolutions per minute. Then power started dropping off as revs climbed higher. The mystery motor kept pulling harder and harder as revs rose. It felt almost unnatural, almost supernatural. Mechanics would watch tachometers climb past 6,000 revolutions per minute and expect the engine to flatten out. Instead, it kept charging. peak power didn't arrive until nearly 7,000 revolutions per minute. That was Formula One territory. That was racing motorcycle territory. That wasn't supposed to be possible with a big American V8. And that frightened people. Drivers weren't accustomed to engines that encouraged aggressive RPM. Most stock block V8s were designed for low-end torque. You shifted early and used displacement to move the car. The mystery motor rewarded high RPM. It demanded aggressive driving. It required confidence to keep your foot down while the tachometer climbed into ranges that felt dangerous. Because sometimes they were dangerous. Then Daytona arrived. At the 1963 Daytona 500, Chevrolet unleashed its secret weapon. The reaction was immediate. Competitors were stunned. During practice sessions, Chevrolet drivers were posting times that seemed impossible. Speeds on the straightaways were much higher than expected. Acceleration out of the turns was devastating. Ford's team chiefs watched in disbelief. Chrysler's engineers scrambled for explanations. The cars were faster than expected. Much faster. Veteran mechanics crowded around the engine bays, trying to figure out what Chevrolet had done. But the cylinder heads didn't match any known Chevrolet design. The valve covers were unmarked. There were no identifying casting numbers visible. Reporters began asking questions. What engine is that? Where did it come from? When will it be available? Nobody from Chevrolet would answer directly. The official response was vague corporate speak that revealed nothing. Reporters began calling it the mystery motor because nobody could identify the cylinder heads. The nickname stuck, and the legend was born. Johnny Rutherford, Rex White, and other Chevrolet drivers suddenly had machinery capable of challenging anything Ford or Chrysler could bring. These weren't unknown privateers. These were professional racers who understood exactly what they were driving, and they knew they had something special, something unprecedented. At speed, the cars looked unstoppable. Top speeds approached 180 miles per hour on Daytona's banking. In an era when aerodynamics were primitive and safety standards were minimal, that was genuinely dangerous territory. The cars had lap belts, not racing harnesses. Roll cages were basic tube construction. Fire suppression systems were crude. Fuel cells didn't exist yet. One mistake could be fatal, and sometimes it was. The horsepower war wasn't just a competition. It was becoming a survival test. Every increase in speed reduced reaction time. Every mile per hour added energy that had to be controlled during a crash. Drivers knew the risks. They raced anyway. But then the real nightmare started. Raw speed exposed weaknesses everywhere else. The mystery motor's tremendous power overwhelmed supporting components. Everything designed for 400 horsepower suddenly faced 600. Transmissions failed, gears stripped under acceleration, synchronizers couldn't handle the torque, clutches burned trying to manage launches, rear axles shattered, ring and pinion gears failed, axle shafts twisted, differential housings cracked, drive shafts twisted under immense torque. The rotating mass and vibration harmonics at high RPM caused failures nobody had anticipated. The mystery motor generated so much power that supporting components often became the limiting factor. One crew chief reportedly joked that the engine was trying to escape the car. He wasn't entirely wrong. The engine mounts struggled to contain the torque reactions. The entire drivetrain twisted under acceleration. Chassis flex became visible. Race teams strengthened gearboxes, reinforced differentials, upgraded cooling systems. Every solution revealed another weak link. It was like trying to contain a tornado inside a steel box. Stronger transmissions required better clutches. Better clutches required stronger flywheels. Stronger flywheels changed rotational inertia. Changed inertia affected acceleration characteristics. Everything connected to everything else. And yet, despite the challenges, the engine continued proving itself. At tracks across America, competitors watched Chevrolet's secret weapon gain momentum. Ford engineers took notice. Chrysler engineers took notice, because something bigger was happening. The mystery motor wasn't merely winning races, it was changing engine design.
The canted-valve cylinder head concept proved so effective that Chevrolet engineers immediately began planning its successor. That successor would eventually become the Mark IV big block Chevrolet. The famous 396, the legendary 427, the iconic 454. These engines would power everything from Corvettes to Chevelles, from drag cars to marine applications, from street machines to professional racing. Millions of enthusiasts would celebrate those engines for decades, but few realized their DNA came directly from the mystery motor. The Mark IV big blocks used a refined version of the canted-valve architecture. The combustion chamber design was nearly identical. The engineering principles were the same. Yet just as Chevrolet appeared ready to dominate, politics intervened. And politics can kill even the greatest engineering projects. General Motors still maintained its official anti-racing policy. Corporate executives worried about public perception. Safety concerns were growing.
Government scrutiny was increasing. Insurance companies were becoming nervous. The horsepower war was attracting negative attention. Newspaper editorials criticized manufacturers for encouraging dangerous driving. Safety advocates pointed to rising accident rates. Congressional hearings were looming. Racing success suddenly looked like a liability. Internally, tensions grew. Engineers wanted more development. Executives wanted distance. The conflict became impossible to ignore. Imagine spending years creating one of the most advanced racing engines in America. Imagine proving it works. Imagine demonstrating that it could beat the competition, then being told to stop. That's exactly what happened. Official factory support remained limited. Development resources became harder to secure. Budgets were cut. Projects were canceled. The project's future became uncertain. Engineers who had devoted themselves to the mystery motor watched their work get buried. Not because it failed, not because it was inadequate, because it was politically inconvenient. The engine wasn't banned, it wasn't outlawed, but it was effectively silenced. And that distinction matters, because the technology survived, the concept survived, the engineering lessons survived. Only the original project disappeared. Most people don't realize how close Chevrolet came to rewriting racing history. Had GM fully committed to the mystery motor program, the horsepower war of the 1960s might have looked very different. Ford's dominance could have been challenged earlier and more effectively. The famous Total Performance campaign might have faced serious opposition. Chrysler's famous Hemi might have faced a far more dangerous rival. The legendary status of the 426 Hemi might have been shared with Chevrolet's creation. NASCAR history itself could have changed. Different winners, different championships, different legends. Instead, the mystery motor became a ghost, a machine remembered by racers but largely forgotten by the public. And yet its influence spread everywhere. The later Mark IV big block engines borrowed heavily from its architecture. High-performance marine engines adopted similar concepts. Drag racers studied its airflow characteristics. Engineers across the industry learned from its successes. Even decades later, cylinder head designers continued referencing ideas first proven by the mystery motor. That's the funny thing about revolutionary technology. Sometimes it doesn't need to survive to win. Sometimes changing the future is enough. Today, original mystery motors are incredibly rare. Only a handful remain in existence. Most were destroyed or reconfigured. GM wanted to erase evidence of their racing involvement. Collectors treasure them. Historians obsess over them. And whenever one appears at an auction or vintage racing event, enthusiasts gather around it like archaeologists discovering a lost civilization. Because that's essentially what it is. A glimpse into an alternate future. A future where Chevrolet openly embraced racing. A future where one secret engine changed the balance of power. Listen to one run today, and you'll understand immediately. The exhaust note is different, sharper, angrier, more mechanical. You aren't hearing just another big block V8. You're hearing the sound of an engineering experiment that escaped the laboratory and briefly terrified an entire industry. And that's why the mystery motor still matters. Not because it was the most famous, not because it won the most races, but because it proved what was possible. It showed what happened when engineers ignored limits and chased performance above everything else. The deadliest racing engine GM ever made wasn't silenced because it failed. It was silenced because it succeeded too well. In the end, the mystery motor became something bigger than a race engine. It became a symbol of an era when manufacturers were willing to risk everything for speed, when engineers pushed technology faster than regulations could keep up, and when horsepower itself became a weapon. And perhaps that's why its story still fascinates people more than 60 years later. Because buried beneath the legends, the rumors, and the myths is a simple truth. For a brief moment in 1963, Chevrolet built an engine so advanced that the rest of the racing world didn't even know what it was looking at. And by the time they figured it out, it was already disappearing into history. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what forgotten racing engine you'd like to see next. There are plenty of incredible machines whose stories have almost been lost to time. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the engines, rivalries, and engineering battles that changed automotive history forever.